The phase of globalization we witnessed between the early 1990s and the recent crisis was one in which a disproportionate share of new wealth was captured by elite knowledge and information producers in a few major urban centers. Over the years to come, we'll see political pressure to claw some of those gains back. These are the views of Professor Don Ross, who's the Dean of the Faculty of Commerce at the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. He's also a Professor of Philosophy and a Professor of Economics at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. Thank you very much for coming through. Let's just talk about the changing characteristics of the world today, just to simplify what I've just said earlier on. People look at the world today and they say, oh, the Chinese are getting wealthier, the Indians are getting wealthier, and the conventional wealth in the West is dwindling.
That's partially true, but it's a very, very incomplete and I think distorted sort of story. Certainly, America and Europe are going through a very bad patch. They're in fiscal crisis, high unemployment, low growth. China and India and a number of the BRIC countries in general are enjoying high growth and are in much healthier fiscal situations. For Europe, there really may be a long-run decline story happening because of the aging populations and the unsustainable welfare commitments that the governments face. America, what people often forget that in the case of America, although it has lots of problems, it remains the world's most dynamic economy, and furthermore, its actual share of world population is rising in relative terms, not falling. Africa has the fastest rising share of world population, but America is second. So I don't think the long-run story is quite as simple as a decline of the North and rise of the BRICS. There is, I think, a very interesting dimension in which some of the very same political economic dynamics are prevailing across the world, in China, in America, and for that matter in South Africa.
What are those dynamics?
Well, as you indicated in your lead-off, the nature of the particular phase of globalization that the world went through in the 90s and for most of the last decade before the beginning of the recession was one that was characterized by certain particular features, notably an extremely rapid and heavy increase in world trade volumes and a very rapid increase in global intercontinental financial flows. When you have economic change of that nature that involves a lot of money will tend to flow towards those who control the trade networks, who control the new interactive networks that are developing. And in this case, it was a fairly narrow set of information managers and people who controlled certain network hubs of the global economy in a few major cities, New York, London, and for that matter, Shanghai. And if we look at what's happening politically in America right now, we see a populist backlash against some of those elites, which is likely to end in some wealth redistribution. But in China, just the same thing. People often don't appreciate that during the 90s, the Chinese Gini coefficient, the level of inequality, rose considerably, and that was mostly redistribution of wealth from relatively already poorer parts of China, the countryside, towards the rich cities. Since as part of China's response to the recession, we're seeing a little bit of a reversal of that. We're seeing some money moving back out of the cities and being clawed back to the regions.
Everybody right now is preoccupied with solutions to catalyze growth and to equalize the spoils of global trade so that those who've been poor can start to access this global wealth. And when we look at some of the figures, the BRIC countries now constitute something like 13% of global trade, and it's believed that by year 2015, they will be responsible for 60% of global growth, in a way in which the United States cannot do and will not do, even though the United States will, for the foreseeable future, be about 27% of global GDP.
That's right. Yes.
So where are the corrections that are needed? How are the solutions going to come about? Because you cannot discount the growing middle class in Asia and the BRIC economies and the role that they're going to start playing as consumers to shift the dynamics of global trade.
Yeah, I'm not so much in the line I'm indicating today. I'm not so much indicating what I think should happen or what I think is best for the world, but what I think will happen whether we like it or not. I think what we're likely to see in many countries are increases in personal taxes. Income taxes and property taxes, those are inevitably going to be felt principally by those who were the principal gainers from the phase of globalization over the past couple of decades, because there's going to be political pressure for a kind of clawback. Politics tends to revert to the mean. If one group does particularly well as a result of special circumstances, in complex, dynamic political societies like China or America or South Africa, there will tend to be a reversion. So I don't think it'll be good, particularly for South Africa's growth, for example, if our already narrow tax base gets squeezed even further. That won't be good for growth, and it won't be good for...
Okay, I see you nodding, Andrew.
Yeah, I think the question that I had is, in the South African context, you've got such a small constituency that generate, from a personal perspective, so much tax. If this were to happen, and we're in an environment where the Gini coefficient is really widening and continues to do so, how does such a small sector of the population cope with such a burden?
Yeah, it's going to struggle. I wish I could be more optimistic about the South African political economy going forward, but I think we're, excuse me, particularly badly placed, given our current circumstances, for what we're likely to see. I think we're already seeing it politically. I think some of the tensions we're seeing in South Africa between the sort of more nationalist factions within the governing party and the COSATU SACP side of the party is similar to the kind of political tensions we're seeing in other parts of the world. It's a tension between urban, relatively middle-class people and those who were really excluded from the last couple of phases of the last phase of globalization.
Okay, we've seen an interesting phenomenon, and something you've alluded to earlier on. We've just seen in China workers assert their rights, and Beijing have to give in to those demands, and wages increasing somewhat. In China, many are concerned that those wage increases will be factored into the cost of production, and eventually Chinese goods will be quite expensive. That's for us who import Chinese goods. But what does that mean for the Chinese consumer and this battle between the rising elite in these emerging markets and those who are seen as a traditionally cheap labor base?
Well, it seems to me that from the, if one, to the extent that one is mainly concerned for, or is concerned for, the welfare of Chinese people in general, but in the case of China, to the extent that one is interested in the welfare of China, these trends look like happy ones. What it means for a country to get wealthier is for its consumers to be able to consume more. And the distorted nature of Chinese growth, particularly in the 90s, particularly under the Jiang Zemin administration, the distorted nature of that growth that so heavily favored a few coastal cities, meant in effect that the average Chinese consumer didn't participate as fully as might have been expected, given the very, very high growth in GDP, the very, very high growth in productivity. Now I think they're going to start to enjoy some of those fruits, and China will hopefully look more like a normal economy.
I mean, I didn't ask you this question earlier on because I knew we were going to have this conversation. This idea of boosting consumerism in China, the pressure that's on China to develop internally as opposed to just pump the world with its exports. The argument against it, or the argument that says it won't work very well, is that there's a very strong savings culture in China which is politically induced. And so even if Chinese workers are earning more money, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to spend.
Yeah, but I think you have to take into context the size of that population. It's a numbers game ultimately. It will have an effect, and I suppose the question is, will the rest of the world ever get access back into that market? That remains to be seen. What I find interesting about the professor's remarks over there is the analogy that one can draw with South Africa is you've got a burgeoning middle class, you've got this demand for higher wages, and the sacrifice that we've made has been employment and growth to a certain extent, and this is the problem that we're battling with at the moment. When one looks in the Chinese context, you wonder if they would be able to sustain these levels of growth with higher wage bases, and whether that will change the dynamics once again of a trajectory that we think is set in stone, and it's definitely going to happen that way, and maybe it won't. Okay,
let's bring this issue back to South Africa also, because we've been mentioning the public sector strikes, and that almost becomes the generalized stereotypical image of what South Africa represents, a militant vocal, politicized labor force, not very productive, always demanding high wages, and that's the stereotype. And often some people would say that's actually the reality of what it means to do business in South Africa, which makes it unattractive as an investment destination. And if investors are scared to come in because the political dynamics seem so tense, as it were, then we've got a problem on our hands, because we need to be growing by 6% in order just to create at least 500,000 jobs per annum.
Yes, all of that is true. I mean, I think we're in a more vulnerable spot just now, I think, than many people realize. We've got strong capital flows coming in, mainly because of very, very low interest rates in rich countries. That won't last forever. It doesn't seem to me that at the moment we're doing very much ourselves to position ourselves well for a change in the economic circumstances in which. So, you know, we can't keep increasing wages without underlying growth in productivity that so far we're not seeing signs of, and so we should be concerned.
Okay, talking about those capital inflows, which are quite high, there is a sense that investors prefer to come in that way, because with exchange controls being what they are, it's easier to move their money to and from the economy. Whereas what we actually need is FDI, and the FDI, being the physical investment, is what investors are not prepared to do. How do we overcome that given the political environment?
Well, certainly I think now would be a propitious moment to remove exchange controls. What better set of conditions could we possibly ask for? We're a bit concerned that the rand is a little bit too high. We're concerned about hot money. We would like to change the nature of the FDI that's coming into us. And we're sitting on historically low interest rates for us. Why on earth would we not, if we're never going to see a better window for removing exchange controls than now. So if we don't remove exchange controls now, one must start to doubt that there ever could be economic or political circumstances in which we would. That, of course, is a minor measure. I mean, it's just the current circumstances say try that, but that's not going to make a big change to our long-run circumstance. I think the crucial fix is going to have to be political. The governing party is going to somehow have to find a way to address the tensions between the various political, economic interests within itself. To the extent that it doesn't, what we basically get are factions within the ANC vetoing decisive action across all policy fronts.
All right, just a final question, Andrew, and then Professor, if you can just comment on that one. Is the changing shift in demographics worldwide, Europe and to an extent America, but Europe in particular and Japan are getting older, and the emerging markets are looking younger.
Sure.
So even as we're talking this middle class, there aren't enough people coming in to fill the necessary labor needed for an industrial base, because either the population is too young or it's too old.
Sure.
And that's how the world is changing.
I think that's one of the primary drivers and one of the advantages that many of the emerging markets have. If you look in an African context, the excitement around Nigeria, for example, with this growing younger population. The other thing to bear in mind is when you look at these older growing populations, is not only are they not contributing, but they're actually drawing out in the form of pension funds. And so the capital flows that you see reverse totally, and it becomes a very difficult position for them to be in. I think the markets that will drive it from here on in will be demographically based, and I think that will be a major factor in terms of growth, in terms of capital flows going forward.
But let's not forget that China's got an aging population as well. I mean, if I were going to live a lot longer than I have any reason to believe that I would, and I were investing in a emerging market, my long-term money would be in India rather than China.
Sure.
India looks to me to have the great combination of younger population, very, very large internal market, ultimately to be bigger than China's, and a greater level of decentralization, so that there's room for policy experiments in different parts of India, and what I would expect to be in the long run a more dynamic growth path.